Do churches generally go through the same life cycle? I'm Daniel Jennings, and today we're going to answer that question. Statistically, every Sunday in the United States, 71 congregations will celebrate their last service. Annually, some 3,700 churches will close every year in the United States. These are churches that previously had been thriving, growing, prosperous congregations and had existed for decades. But they have reached the point to where it just seemed impossible to continue going on, at least in the fashion that they were, and the decision was made to go ahead and close the church. Many people do not realize that regardless of the denomination, churches generally go through the same phases from birth to death. It doesn't matter if it's a Methodist, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Pentecostal, or whatever kind of congregation. There are similar phases that they all seem to go through from the beginning to the end. These include an initial phase, a growth phase, a plateau phase, a decline phase, and then finally an ending phase. And these 5 phases can be likened to the human life cycle of birth, adolescence, adulthood, old age, and death. And so today what we want to do is we want to look at these 5 cycles in the life cycle of a church so that we can recognize them and see how we can use that information to perhaps help congregations that seem to be heading towards the death phase. The initial phase begins when a small group of individuals become motivated by what they perceive to be a lack of right thinking in the established churches in their community. They believe that God is not being honored by the existing churches in their area and feel that if they are going to serve God the way that He wants them to, the only way they can do it is to start a new organization with the established goal of that purpose of serving God the way that He is calling them to do it. They'll be very focused in the initial phase on seeking God in their personal lives through things like holy living, personal prayer times, and fasting, as well as seeking God as a corporate body together with prayer meetings and community times of fasting and so forth. And at times they may seem legalistic in the initial phase, as they are very adamant about even seemingly little things that they feel have been overlooked and should be emphasized as important. The initial phase is marked by serious steps being taken to ensure that the testimony of the group is maintained according to their standards. This emphasis on purity in the group actually has the effect of repelling those who do not agree with the goals and the beliefs of the group to not want to be a part of it and actually go somewhere else. The initial phase is followed by a period marked with an aggressive propagation of what the group feels is God's will, not only for them, but for the whole community. And this is the growth phase, and it's marked by an emphasis on the members trying to get the message out to the community. During this phase, marked steps will be taken to get the message out, to include going door to door, setting up booths at events or outside of stores, contacting friends and relatives to share with them the group's understanding of God's will. And this will be coupled together with spiritual fervency of prayer and fasting to try and seek God's blessing and power to go out and spread the message to people and to persuade them that what they feel is correct is really true, and that other people also need to believe that. It's at some point, usually during the growth phase, that an actual building is purchased or built by the organization to become a permanent meeting place for the group. Well, after the growth phase, we enter into the plateau phase. And the plateau phase is the phase in which the growth begins to wane for the group. The original zeal that motivated the group has diminished by this period, and the group now begins to go through a period of stagnation. They have plateaued kind of to where they are trying to reach, and from here on out, it's all downhill. In the plateau phase, the original zeal that motivated the group has diminished, and it's during this phase that the church actually begins to resemble those other churches that were looked at in the initial phase, and the group originally said, we can't have anything to do with these other churches, we have to start something new so that we can really be the people that God wants us to be. Well, in the plateau phase, the church begins to resemble those other churches that perhaps decades earlier had been abandoned. It is in the plateau phase that the shift begins to focus away from the spiritual message that motivated those in the initial phase, and the emphasis begins to be on making sure that the physical church organization that has been created keeps going. Prayer and fasting are not as important in the plateau phase, the spiritual disciplines, as are things that are needed in order to keep the physical church going, such as business meetings, the budget, building upkeep, and things like that. During the plateau phase, there'll be vestiges of the old mindset. You'll see signs like on the front where it says Wednesday evening prayer meeting at 7 o'clock, which is a reference back to how in the original group, prayer was very important to them. But now, even though it says that on the sign, very little to any prayer goes on at those meetings. Another sign that a group has entered into the plateau phase is that they begin to be overtaken by a fear of offending people, whereas the people in the initial group didn't care if they offended people. They were telling people that they didn't want to be a part of these other congregations because these other congregations were not serving God the way that they needed to be, and they didn't care if that offended them, and they just went out and served God the way that they felt He was leading them to. Well, in the plateau phase, the fear kind of begins to gain a stronghold in the congregation of offending people who have been coming to the church or who may potentially come to the church. And so that causes the church to kind of change the message. You know, the emphasis of what was perceived as legalism and strictness in the beginning is replaced by kind of a permissiveness and just a quietness and a toning down of the standards that one time had been the hallmarks of the organization. Well, the plateau phase is followed by the decline phase. And the decline phase is marked by a noticeable decrease in membership. And this usually takes the place of members of the congregation growing older and dying with no new people coming in. And one sign that a church has entered into the decline phase is that sometimes that is when a church split will occur. And what happens is that the people who still want to hold to those original ideals kind of come at heads and at odds with those in the plateau phase who are kind of like, well, we don't want to offend anybody, we just want to keep things going. And, those two polar opposites come at each other or come at heads against each other. And sometimes they just feel like we just can't continue serving God the way He's calling us to in this organization, which is just a repeat of the cycle that had happened in the initial phase when the group's founders said that about the existing congregations that they were a part of or saw. It's during the decline phase that it'll be common to hear the expression like, we really need to grow. And that's because everybody's dying or has left the church and the church is in incredible decline. But when people use that expression saying we really need to grow, they're not really talking so much about spiritual growth. They're focusing more on growing the number of attenders so that this organization can continue on. By the time the church gets to the decline phase, people would just be happy to see the seats filled up on a Sunday morning. They're not so focused on spiritual growth as they were in the beginning. Well, this is followed by the ending phase. And the ending phase occurs when the membership decreases to a point where that the physical church can no longer exist because there's just not sufficient funds coming in to pay the utility bills and the insurance and the pastor's salary and so forth. By this point, the church is usually no longer interested in the spiritual goals that motivated the initial founders of the movement. And even though there's a small group of people left that could continue to promote those ideals, they may not be able to meet in the big sanctuary anymore, but they can always go to their homes and have Bible studies in their home and begin to pray and fast together to continue to promote those ideals that motivated the original group, those ideals of spiritual purity and holiness towards God. Even though they could do that, by this point, they just don't seem to care anymore. And so what happens is they close down and they just go and find another congregation, generally, to start attending. The closing of the physical church and the decision to assimilate into an already existing congregation represents the death and ending phase of the group. When we look at congregations, when we look at the life cycle of a congregation, what we see is that a couple of things stand out, and that is that the more time goes by, the more the emphasis becomes, not on God, but on the organization. And whereas the group started out with a total zeal for God, over time that zeal and that emphasis diminished, yet at the same time, the emphasis and the zeal for the organization, that they started, whether it's First Baptist Church or Second Presbyterian Church, or, whatever this group is that they eventually end up calling themselves, that emphasis on the organization has just overtaken everything. God has been put in second place, and the institution has become the primary focus of the organization, keeping it going. And so it comes as no surprise that when a church gets so off base like that they end up closing down. In the initial phase, they begin really with an emphasis on the message. But by the time they get to the ending phase, the emphasis of the message has been forgotten. Instead, the emphasis by that time has generally been replaced by an emphasis on the organization. The initial group is not really concerned with their physical organization. In the beginning, they don't even have a building to identify themselves with. But they have a movement. They have a move of the Holy Spirit that they identify with. And that motivates them to go out and preach the message to the world. But by the time they reach the end, as you can see, that emphasis on the organization has just overtaken everything. God has been put in second place, and the institution has become the primary focus of the organization, keeping it going. And so it comes as no surprise that when a church gets so off base like that they end up closing down. I'm Daniel R. Jennings, and this has been another life lesson.